in 1776 denounced this as an absurd and visionary theory, just as he would later label all notions of natural rights as nonsense on stilts. Living in an age that is characterized, at least aspirationally, by an ostensible commitment to universal human rights, we are understandably inclined to privilege the rights emphasis of the second paragraph and to ignore much else that is in the Declaration, not to mention rejecting Bentham in favor of some philosophy more compatible with taking rights seriously. But as David Armitage emphasizes in his invaluable study of the impact of the Declaration around the world, it was the first and last paragraphs of the Declaration that had, and in many important ways continue to have, far more import than the assertions of rights set out in paragraph 2. And in the remainder of my remarks, and I'll try to confine them to roughly 20 minutes or so there is some time for discussion, I and my co-author Jack Balkin want to emphasize particularly paragraph 1, and for that matter, the very last paragraph. Begin with paragraph 1, which announces the right of one people, most definitely not isolated individuals, but one collective people, to cast off the bonds of political union that were no longer consented to, and to proclaim the entry of that people. Indeed, in the last paragraph, it turns out to the entry, presumably, of 13 states who are uneasily organized together as one people to proclaim their entry into the international community of sovereign states with all the privileges that statehood brought with it in the public international law of the 18th century and thereafter. Within the United States, however, these all-important assertions of popular sovereignty at the heart of the beginning and end of the Declaration passed into insignificance once the Treaty of Paris established and future events solidified the independent existence of the United States of America. Quote, once independence had become an uncontested fact, Armitage writes, Americans had little need to remember the assertion of independent statehood in the Declaration's opening and closing paragraphs, end quote. What remained to be revered was the second paragraph, whatever its philosophical rigor. So that's one thing that Jack and I want to emphasize. That is the first paragraph and the assertion of popular collective sovereignty, and not, I'm tempted to say, merely the assertion of the existence of individual rights. Armitage goes on to assert that it is equally self-evident, the Declaration goes on to assert that it is equally self-evident that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, that is, of securing inalienable rights, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. This, too, is a very, very radical sentence that has implications not only for political theorists, but I think it's safe to say okay, am I on again?
Yes.
Okay, I'm sorry for that glitch. These have implications for contemporary politics. I have argued elsewhere that the most important political figure in the 21st century, I should say, putting it slightly differently, that the most important political figure in the 20th century with continuing impact in the 21st century is not Vladimir Lenin, but is Woodrow Wilson. That is the Wilson who announced in World War I that not only were we entering a war to make the world safe for democracy, but also announced the principle of self-determination of peoples, and that this was a fundamental bedrock principle not only of American foreign policy, but also implicitly something the entire world should adopt. This is based not on the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness provision of the Declaration, but rather on the very, very first sentence about one people being able to slough off, to secede from the British Empire in the name of popular self-determination. And it is this part of the Declaration that Armitage suggests, and I think is backed up amply by the public record, that has had at least as much influence as the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness sentence. And one can be certainly ambivalent about the influence of the notion of popular self-determination. Begin with the assertion that we were one people in 1776, or indeed the assertion in the Federalist number 2 that Providence had blessed us by being a united people sharing a language, religion, common background, and common manners. I would hope that Jack, a justifiably esteemed historian of that period, as well as Mark, would agree with me that Publius's assertion is really quite preposterous, even if you ignore the fact that there was a sizable slave population. But think only of German speakers in Pennsylvania, of the fact that Catholics were the subject of some persecution, Catholics and other heretics were the subjects of some persecution in some of the colonies, that we certainly did not share the same manners with regard to organizing labor systems. So one might regard Federalist 2, or for that matter, the first sentence of the Declaration, of an aspiration, but in fact it was presented as an empirical fact. And it seems to me that at the very least, attention should be paid to how one decides when there is one people as against multiple peoples, under what circumstances one people do have a right to collective self-determination, even if this means, and then you can fill in the blank, it can mean secession, as was true in 1776 with regard to the British Empire, and as was true with regard to the Confederacy in 1861. Indeed, if one goes down to the Texas State Capitol and looks at one of the 3 monuments to the Confederate dead that can be found on the grounds of the Texas Capitol, the most prominent one roots secession in the Principles of 76. And I suspect that the principle they're talking about is not simply, or perhaps not even at all, the theory of natural rights, but rather the belief that one people, in that particular case, the collective people of the Confederacy, are always free to alter and abolish whatever system of government they are living under when they come to the conclusion that the existing system is no longer conducive to their public happiness. I presume that all of us oppose the Confederacy and what the Confederacy did, but Mark has written a wonderful book about Dred Scott and the run-up to the war. And I think it's a vital question of whether one supports Lincoln's suppression of Confederate independence, Confederate secession, on the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. Do we support what he did, and do we view him as earning his monument because he was A, always a faithful constitutionalist, B, was always committed to the tenets of self-government, or because he correctly opposed slavery and correctly chose to prevent secession as what we might call today humanitarian intervention. But I don't know to what extent we automatically share his view of mystic chords of memory that would require remaining within a union if a group that, with some degree of plausibility, let me suggest no less plausibility than the assertion in 1776 that there was one people casting off the bonds of the iniquitous British Empire, or the assertion of Publius in 1787 that we were one people. It seems to me that the Confederacy can make a non-frivolous argument, and that what is crucial with Confederacy is that they were evil, not that they were violating certain tenets of the Declaration of Independence. There are, of course, other ways one might alter and abolish. One could engage in out-and-out revolution to try to take over a government in the name of correct values, including the values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Armitage makes the point, and I think it is an important point, that the events of 1861, 1865 were not really and truly a civil war, at least in as much as the Confederacy did not want to capture Washington and take over the entire American government. They did want to capture Washington for bargaining purposes, but not in order to take over the entire government. What they wanted was independence, just as George Washington and James Madison and the people about whom Jack has written so very well did not intend to move on to London after obtaining independence within the United States in order to take over the British Empire and get rid of a philosophically indefensible monarchy in terms of the values of self-government articulated in the Declaration. In that sense, it was a limited sort of political gesture, but of course, we are familiar with civil wars that are conducted in the language of rights, and bringing rights to the entire people and overthrowing a government that is engaged in one or another long train of abuses. And so another obvious question, which I assume will be discussed at some point today, is how one exactly decides whether there is a sufficiently long train of abuses to justify revolutionary violence. There is a fascinating speech by Senator William Smith of South Carolina in 1830 during the nullification crisis, in which he basically demeans what was being done to the American colonists. He suggests that they really were tax avoiders who didn't want to pay a very minimal 3-penny tax on tea, and behaved as if the world was coming to an end. And then he went on to suggest that if you really want to see an abuse, it's the tariff of abominations, and the rejection of what Mark particularly has described as the bisectional compromise that was an important part of at least the tacit constitution that was proposed and ratified in 1788, and that the tariff was the rejection of that kind of bisectionality, insofar as, at least from South Carolina's perspective, it clearly preferred the interests of the manufacturing North over that of the cotton-growing South. Now, again, I'm not really inclined to present Senator Smith as my hero for all sorts of reasons, but at the very least, he does force one to ask were the British and King George really sufficiently tyrannical to justify violent overthrow of the government? Because if they meet the sufficient tyranny test, then when you move forward to the 20th and 21st century, where there are all sorts of governments who make King George and the British Parliament look quite benevolent indeed, the Declaration can become a recipe for endless violence, endless warfare in the name either of the self-evident goodness of self-determination, whatever the values are that underlie the notion of self-determination, or violence in the name of protecting a certain set of rights. I don't really mean to be denouncing the Declaration of Independence. It's a fine declaration, and I have done my share of reading it aloud on July 4th. What I do want to suggest is that we're making a huge, huge mistake if we view the Declaration of Independence as something merely anodyne or merely inspirational. It may be inspirational, but one ought to recognize that what it can inspire is a variety of violent political actions carried out not only by groups we might admire, such as George Washington and his friends, but by groups I assume we don't admire, like the Confederacy, and by a variety of groups across the world, some of which we admire in the name of Wilsonian self-determination, others being collective selves who under no circumstances should be allowed to engage in self-determination, because what they most want to do is to oppress others. Now you can say, well, the good news is that those who will be oppressed can also engage in revolutionary violence, but then that really does become a recipe for the endless violence that I'm afraid characterizes the politics of the 21st century, that was in its own way begun by the events of 1776, the French Revolution, and then moving forward into the world we occupy today. I'm done.
There's something deeply Lenin-esque about the frozen picture of Sandy staring at us.
Thanks, Andy. So, and you're going to hang on with us
Oh, yes.
as we proceed. So, as I said earlier, I think with this panel, we'll go ahead and do all three papers, and then Mark and I and Sandy will free associate and try to, come up with some responses. My talk actually begins here in Philadelphia in July 1776, or I should say the late spring and summer 1776. Some of what I'm going to say, I think, will echo some of Sandy's themes. In some ways, I may diverge. It is one of the many ironies of Thomas Jefferson's complicated life that in the late spring of 1776, he was stuck here in Philadelphia, composing the Declaration of Independence, when he really wanted to be back in Williamsburg, his old college town, working on a new constitution of government for the Commonwealth of Virginia. In mid-May 1776, the day after the Continental Congress instructed the colonies to draft new constitutions of government, Jefferson wrote a revealing letter home, suggesting that the Virginia Provincial Convention, the Fifth Virginia Provincial Convention, might, quote, recall for a short time their delegates to Congress to aid in that project. It is a work of the most interesting nature, and such as every individual would wish to have a voice in. In truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy, Jefferson continued. For should a bad government be instituted for us in future, it had been as well to accept at first the bad one offered us from beyond the water without the risk and expense of contest. But Virginia already had enough talented hands, led by George Mason, and it could include the young James Madison, available in Williamsburg. And it had too few members of Congress to depute to Philadelphia. So Jefferson was marooned here through the summer, drafting the document that secured his eternal fame rather than being able to return home to see his wife Martha and to participate in that great work that he originally saw, many of us think correctly, as the whole object of the present controversy. 50 years later, at his death, on the providentially selected 4th of July, 1826, Jefferson had come to understand that his own reputation had been well served by the circumstances that kept him in Philadelphia. In his very last letter, written on June 24, 1826, Jefferson recalled the Declaration of Independence less as a testament to the break with Great Britain or to the creation of new forms of government than as a tribute to the general liberation of mankind. Maybe this is Jefferson in Sandy's terms as a proto-Wilsonian. We can come back to this later. Jefferson wrote, "May it be to the world what I believe it will be, to some part sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition have persuaded them to bind themselves, and to assume the blessings and security of self-government." Part of that liberation, Jefferson noted, still involved the adoption of Republican governments. But it also had a deeper meaning, to confirm, quote, "the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God." Jefferson's letter, by the way, has 17th century English antecedents. So Jefferson was not making this up of his own voice, but actually wedding the 17th century English revolutionary tradition with the one to which he was contributing. Now, over the exact half a century that passed between Jefferson's authorship of the Declaration and his own death, his understanding of that document, of the Declaration of Independence, evolved in ways that illustrate its complex legacy for us. For two reasons, the Declaration of Independence is a world historical document of the first order of magnitude. First, the event it declares marked the appearance of a new political society that would assume among the powers of the earth a status rather greater and grander than the separate and equal station that the American colonists originally desired in 1776. Whether or not one is a card-carrying American exceptionalist, we should all concede that the invention of the United States involves something more than a routine process of nation building. There were, after all, no precedents for the transition of colonial settler societies into self-governing independent states, nor for the development of concrete practical means for making those governments the product of a direct expression of popular sovereignty. Both those precedents were, I believe, embedded in the Declaration's original premise and purpose, to affirm the right of the people, and the quote here, to affirm, quote, "the right of the people to alter and abolish a government that was destructive of fundamental rights," and then, quote, "to institute new government grounded on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness." So my first claim here, I realize I have to speak more for an audience of lawyers. They have to be more precise in enumerating the claims they want to make. Lee, it's a great example you set in your presentation. My first claim here is I think very close to what Sandy's claim is to link the world historic importance of the Declaration of Independence to this process whereby a people can alter and abolish government, that the equal rights Americans were exercising belong to them collectively as a people either existing or in the making with the right of self-government. So among those principles, the one that ultimately mattered most in American history, however, was the profound commitment to human equality that we and other peoples have long associated with the wording of the Declaration. This is the second great source of the document's world historical status. Whether that condition of equality was initially perceived as a characteristic of peoples or nations endowed with equal rights of self-government on the one hand, or of individuals who were members of one society on the other, is the kind of question that historians, and I suppose other scholars in particular, are bound to ask. To my way of thinking, the original meaning of the Declaration, the one which associates it with the collective right of self-government, rather than any notion of individual equality within that government, to my way of thinking, the original meaning of the Declaration was much closer to the first condition than to the second. Americans were a people now defined by their collective resistance to the tyranny of imperial rule. And the real political point of the Declaration was to demonstrate their eligibility for the diplomatic and military support from abroad that they badly needed. The nature or extent of the equality that would prevail within the new American Commonwealths remained to be determined by forces and factors yet to be identified. Nor was this individual equality a subject that the Declaration as yet had any reason to address. Over the long run, however, that original meaning or purpose came to matter less and less to the Declaration's American readers. In other words, the original purpose of affirming a collective right of self-government. It was the claim to equality within American society, or rather the use of the Declaration to denounce perceived inequalities, that gave this document its recurring appeal throughout our history. Wholly apart from anything that Jefferson meant or the Continental Congress intended, the text of the Declaration, its apparent common sense to ordinary readers, acquired its own distinct authority. All men are created equal, and if that proposition is true, as we like to believe it is, then every perceived inequality that appears unjust or offensive becomes vulnerable to a critique grounded in the Declaration's foundational philosophy. Now, for a historian, the task of assessing the legacy of the Declaration thus involves telling two kinds of stories. One is tied to the question of origins and intentions, the other to the problem of interpretation over time. One is largely limited to the Revolutionary era proper, which I would extend from some point in the 1760s, early 1770s, down to 1789. The other is open-ended in time, indeed continues into our own time. The second version essentially begins when the regular public reading of the Declaration of Independence and its rhetorical appropriation by advocates for one cause or another became part of the nation's political culture. This development, the rhetorical uses of the Declaration, or the evocatory uses of the Declaration within American society and then in other societies, was primarily a post-revolutionary, post-1789 affair. And one great source of evidence for this, and I think it may go against the underlying claim of the conference, is if you take a look at the 20-some volumes of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. This is a great project nearing completion, run out of the State Historical Society of Wisconsin by students of Merle Jensen to publish the complete documentary record of the constitutional debates of 1787, 1789. It's very well indexed. If you actually consult its index and look for references to the Declaration of Independence, what you find are a fairly small, limited number of references, very few of which have any significant interest. I mean, they are fairly routine, fairly pedestrian. So in this sense, one learns the Declaration of Independence was rarely cited, much less examined or deployed in 1787, 1788, with the same emphasis and sophistication that would cover its later popular use in scholarly analysis. The notion, therefore, that one might map the movement in American political thinking from the mid-1770s to the late 1780s by juxtaposing the Declaration and the Constitution as two rival poles, or two poles of political thinking, is a claim that the documentary record really does not support very well. To see the Declaration in its proper historical context, then, at least as a historian like myself would see it, it requires us, therefore, to triangulate, or perhaps one should say to square it, with the other congressional documents to which it should be linked. In other words, what I want to do now in the remainder of the time here is simply to say, as a working historian of the 18th century, someone who spends most of his waking hours, between 1776 and 1787 or 1789, with occasional diversions elsewhere. What I really want to do now, just to take a couple of minutes, is to just explain something about the political context within which I see the Declaration. Now, my basic claim here supports the idea that this is first and foremost a document that was tied to the immediate strategic needs of American resistance in the mid-1770s. There are lots of later uses out there. Many scholars have written well about this. A good part of this conference is designed to develop what those themes were. But if you're a historian in the sense that I am, a historian of the Revolution proper, then trying to determine what was the original initial significance of the Declaration will follow, I think, the course I'm about to sketch out. And I'll leave my text here because this is a fairly easy set of points to summarize. So, years ago when I taught at Colgate, we had a bicentennial summer of 1976. It was the end of my first year of teaching, and a number of prominent scholars came in, and we had a conference on the meaning of the Revolution and commentaries. Robert Goldwyn, who I actually known as a boy, Gerald Ford's White House intellectual, and a kind of fairly well-known Straussian, gave a lecture, on the theme, well, why don't we find any discussion about the nature of Republican government in the Declaration of Independence? To me, there was a fairly obvious answer, which was that, in fact, the Continental Congress, the document which framed and accepted the Declaration, had discussed that issue some weeks earlier. So the beginning point of my analysis would say, if you want to know what Americans thought about the nature of the kinds of governments they're going to create, you go back and you look at the famous resolution that was passed, literally down the street, or I think behind me if I'm pointing in the right direction. That way, I went to college in Philadelphia, but it was out on the main line, so I'm a little shaky on some of the local landmarks. You look at the resolution of May 10, 15, 1776, whose primary target was Pennsylvania, and which was designed to, smooth the transition in each of the colonies where the old legal assemblies were still meeting to have new governments formed under Republican premises. In other words, there's a strong, we don't need to read the Declaration of Independence to understand how Americans were thinking about the nature of Republican government. It's not because there was any reason for the Declaration to address it. It's because those issues had already been addressed in other texts. That's point number one. Point number two, we have to remember that the committee that, in which Jefferson turned out to be the critical active member was one of three committees that were formed on June 10, 1776, after Richard Henry Lee had introduced the resolutions from Virginia, which clearly indicated that a light had been lit or whatever, pointing the path towards independence. So three committees were appointed that day. One was designed to draft a Declaration of Independence. That's the one in which Jefferson took the lead. One, pretty much led by John Adams, formed the plan for model treaties, which was in effect designed to set the nation's basic foreign policy in terms of negotiating with foreign powers, obviously France being the main object. And the third committee was the one chaired by John Dickinson, of Pennsylvania and Delaware fame, the Pennsylvania farmer, which prepared the first draft of the Articles of Confederation. We can see these as three separate tasks, which in a sense they were, but essentially they're three complementary tasks. They all in effect had the same end. The Declaration is meant to declare the existence of an American nation. We can speculate, as Sandy was doing, how much do we care about the fact that the member states are identified versus the idea that there is an American people latently present from the beginning. But the Declaration clearly has that purpose. A new nation is being formed. The Articles of Confederation are meant to specify what political form will that nation take, what kinds of institutions as a confederation will it establish. And the plan for model treaties is meant to act upon both of these other committees by saying, here's the kind of foreign policy that, that we intend to pursue. These were the essential elements of the project. That's the kind of matrix within which the Declaration was meant to operate. No one drafting it, not even Jefferson at the time, with his starry-eyed vision. And I think Jefferson did have a starry-eyed vision of the American future, and I've tried to write about this, in fact. No one was really thinking the Declaration is forming a kind of master text that would guide Americans for any other purposes down the road. There was some immediate set of political concerns that had to be met. That was the agenda. That's what had to be done. Nobody would have thought that the first paragraph or two, however you want to break up the text, will turn into a blueprint for the American future. So that's the kind of limited way in which a historian like myself would say, the Declaration is an interesting document. It's part of a process. We know what purpose it's meant to serve, and that's enough. But of course, since we're all we may not be all originalists now, but many of us are becoming popular constitutionalists, and popular constitutionalism is turning out to be a complex beast, just as originalism was. The Declaration did become, by some point, within a decade or so, decade and a half, 2 decades, whatever, after 1789, not 1776, but after 1789, did become a kind of master text. And as I try to suggest in my remarks, its promise of equality was something that each of us would internalize individually. It could still be revived, as Sandy and others have noted, for revolutionary or secessionist purposes in 1832 or 1861. I think those are the two principal dates, or by other nations around the world, as David Armitage argues in his book. But the deeper meaning of the Declaration, the one that's informed our political culture, the one that says, the American project is a project of human equality for all of us taken as individuals. That's the true lasting legacy of the Declaration, or at least it's, the second great legacy of the Declaration, very much, I think, a post-revolutionary discussion. So I'll end here. I think I've identified some themes that should pick up with what Sandy has said, and now we're going to find out what Mark has to say.
feeling omnipresence of the sort of Sandiest Mao. It's all I can. Looking upon these words, I feel I'll be executed in the Cultural Revolution if they are not improper. But thanks first to Alex, to the Constitutional Center, and to everyone for some very thought-provoking and challenging talks. I want to start with two related paradoxes. Paradox number one, if we look at the Declaration of Independence in contemporary constitutional law and practice, it's clearly there. Over the past 20 years, the Supreme Court has cited the Declaration of Independence 22 times. That may not feel like a whole lot, but it's cited Brown versus Board of Education 22 times. Roe v. Wade, cited only 13 times. So in fact, in terms of citations on civil rights and civil liberties, the Declaration of Independence is probably, in top 5. I haven't run down everything. It's cited a lot. Legal briefs cite the Declaration all the time. The Westlaw number was, I think, 1,623. And by the way, Westlaw mostly focuses on recent briefs, in particular the habit of everybody writing an amicus brief on every case imaginable, which is really only about 30 years old. So we see lawyers citing the Declaration all the time. The Declaration is key to political movements. The Tea Party, Move On, all of them have high cites to declarations. Our presidents, in their speeches, written by people who are informed by law, refer to the Declaration of Independence 50 to 100 times. And yet, despite the fact that lawyers are writing these briefs, lawyers are often writing these speeches, there are only 2 textbooks I know of in constitutional law that include the Declaration of Independence, one of which I just happened to write, which hopefully will be on sale in the lobby. The other paradox is a great many of the lawyers who have written the books that do not include the Declaration maintain that the Declaration has profound implications for today's society, very much what Alex started us off to, and I don't believe that. And so the question sort of is, so if I don't believe that, what's the Declaration doing in my textbook and in my thought? And I think the answer is, I would like to argue today, the Declaration has become something I want to call a celebrity citation. That celebrity citations play a prominent role in American constitutionalism, but not the role we ordinarily think about, and that constitutional pedagogy needs to be reformed to reintegrate the Declaration and other celebrity citations into our students' exercise, in particular as we emphasize constitutional practice. If the practice clearly is cite the Declaration, then I don't really care if someone stands up and says the Declaration is not part of the Constitution. I have an abstract theoretical argument, because in fact, I would very much welcome, in any case that Lee and I are on the opposite side, I will stand up and say the Declaration of Independence supports my view and the Constitution incorporates this, and Lee, please, I beg you, stand up before court and say, the Declaration of Independence, Graeber is absolutely right, darn. The Constitution constitutes the Declaration. I maintain that is malpractice. That in our culture, the Declaration must be on your side, particularly if your opponent says it's on their side, that this is a feature of contemporary practice, and it is malpractice not to teach our students of the importance of this practice to the extent that we can identify it. Well, what is a celebrity citation? To some degree, celebrity citations are like Paris Hilton. Yes, meaning, aha, okay. They are famous for being famous. And in fact, if one looks at a great many citations to the Declaration of Independence, or for that matter, the other great celebrity citation, Brown versus Board of Education. It is simply some lawyer said, you know, it would probably help me to cite the Declaration of Independence. Let me see what I can cite the Declaration of Independence for. So at one point in the reports, Brown is cited for this brand of golf clubs is pretty good. I take it that wasn't what Thurgood Marshall and Jack Greenberg were thinking of in 1954, but that was the citation. The Declaration of Independence gets cited all the time for juries are good things, liberty is a good thing, equality is a good thing, things we all agree on. But more important, celebrity citations belong to no political movement. They belong to all political movements. They are not the exclusive property of any group in American politics, and how they are used depends on that. So we might imagine precedents, particularly enduring precedents of having a history that goes something like this. Early on, the very policy fights for survival. Brown versus Board of Education is decided in 1954. The Declaration of Independence is not decided, but promulgated in 1776. And the first thing is the policy announced by this document going to last? Under a counterfactual history, George Washington gets a little too aggressive, loses, we surrender. So much for the Declaration of Independence. The South rises again. So much for Brown versus Board of Education. In the second phase, the precedent or text fights for extension. Now it's simply no longer a case that we want the policy, American independence, desegregated public schools, but we believe there is a broader principle announced by these policies that extends beyond the policy itself. And when this occurs, in fact, the world divides. So Brown, in 1964, is the precedent of choice for the civil rights movement. It is not the precedent of choice for those opposed to the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement walks into Supreme Court, walks into other places in American Constitution and says, let us expand Brown versus Board of Education. Let us see the full potential of Brown versus Board of Education. And those opposed to civil rights say, let us narrow it as much as possible. No, we don't expand Brown there. And then at some point, particularly if the narrowing movement loses, they make a different point. Namely, we were always for Brown. We were always for the Declaration, and it becomes constitutive. That is to say, it ceases to stand for a particular political movement's goal, and all political movements use it to advance their particular notion of the public good. So it's a very crucial moment that occurs around 1971 where suddenly conservatives say, you know, we were wrong. Brown was right. It is the rightest decision in the Supreme Court, and that's why affirmative action is wrong, and that's why school busing is wrong, because Brown is right. Not because Brown needs to be narrowed, but because if we really understand the principle of Brown, you'll understand why affirmative action is wrong. You'll understand why abortion is wrong. You'll understand the entire conservative agenda follows from Brown being right. And so, in fact, unsurprising with the Declaration of Independence. So, for example, in the same-sex marriage cases, there are 8 briefs that cite the Declaration of Independence, sometimes at great length, rarely celebrity citations. If we understand that the Declaration of Independence says our freedoms come from God, well, God didn't sanction same-sex marriage, and therefore same-sex marriage is wrong. And there are about 7 or 8 briefs that say if we understand the fundamental commitment of the Declaration of Independence to human equality, we will understand that, of course, same-sex marriage is one of the rights of equal protection. And so, in fact, with the Declaration, what the Declaration was about beginning is the fight for early liberalism, or liberal republicanism. I don't really care what you call it, but a vision that says a point of government is to protect fundamental rights. It is not the purpose of government to enrich a few families. It is not the purpose of government to spread the one true religion. It is not the purpose of government to conquer the world, except insofar in doing so we can in fact promote human rights. And in 1776, lots of people believed there were other purposes of government. It is now the case that pretty much everyone at least gives lip service. No, the Declaration of Independence is absolutely right on the principles of government, that the Declaration works not by constraining us, but by constituting us. So one of the ways of thinking about it was, I'm fairly big and was always pretty tall, and a little bit of an athlete, used to play chess. And I was bigger and stronger than any chess player I ever played against in major tournaments, and I never once thought of beating them up as a strategy, threaten, Jack, if you don't lose the game, you're a little smaller, I'm going to beat you up. Who knows? Jack's got a black belt. This may have been the biggest mistake of my life. And that's because, I thought of lots of weird strategies to fool them, but into the game constantly, that's not what you do in chess. You don't make those threats. And so the Declaration works not by constraining us, but through a process of socialization that the sort of projects people conceptualize are projects that are within a plausible understanding of the Declaration. But here now is where problems come in for certain kinds of conceptions of the legal project. In one sense, the Declaration is what Ian Shapiro once called the gross concept. So in fact, there have been studies of equality done by Ian Shapiro's advisor and one of my advisors, Doug Ray, that essentially shows you can demonstrate that any project is an equality project. Equality doesn't rule out much if it rules out everything. So in some sense, the Declaration becomes constitutive because everybody realizes, hey, all I have to do is change my verbs a little bit, and I have a project for the Declaration. But in fact, in its context, the Declaration does rule out some things. But it's better understood as something Cass Sunstein says, an incompletely theorized agreement, which is with respect to the Declaration's projects. There are some things we now agree are paradigmatic cases of violations of the Declaration. Slavery is one of them. We didn't always agree, but now slavery is one of them. We also largely agree that there are some cases that are not at all covered by the Declaration. So in fact, most people believe we ought to put people in jail who commit serious crimes. How much we punish them? I don't know, but very few people have said, prison violates the natural right to liberty no matter how many crimes a person commits, no matter how many danger. And in between, there's a lot of contested turf. Now, what Madison thought, and Madison's most fundamental, not most fundamental, but one of Madison's fundamental constitutional errors was in Federalist 37, where he said, yes, there's a lot of vagueness in the Constitution, but over time, as we settle one problem, it'll be less and less and less. What time has turned out for constitutions is it turns out, imagine we think cases 1 to 10 are clearly in, 11 to 20 are clearly out, and 21 to 30 are contested. When we settle 22, it turns out we destabilized 2 and 12. So without using the spirit of merit, like that, there's always this much, which is somewhat meaningless. It turns out the project of the Declaration of Independence is never ending. Because just as we reach a consensus on some issues, that creates new issues we never heard about and destabilizes others. And the truth of the matter is, in our culture, if a substantial number of people are making the argument that the Declaration of Independence supports something, it's probably not a bad argument, that most people are not stupid. So what does this have to do with the way we teach con law? I think the way we teach con law ignores a number of things. One, it ignores that, in fact, while there are rules, most people have worked out the rules, so it's not like contracts where, in fact, we can assume students come in, they don't know the mirror image rule. Students who we teach next year will know how the Supreme Court decided the same-sex marriage cases. There is no point in teaching the same-sex marriage cases in the way we might teach the mirror image rule, namely, aha, I bet you don't know it. We need to teach it. More important, of all the areas of law, the basics of con law are always in motion. And particularly now, they're heavily in motion, where the change of one judge could change almost everything. How do we keep precedents? How do we expand precedents? And the argument I want to make is the crucial role played by canonical text, such as Brown versus Board of Education and the Declaration of Independence, and anti-canonical text, like Lochner and Dred Scott, where everyone in the legal community assumes are wrongly decided, play in the debates over how to expand precedents, how to narrow precedents, should we overrule them, should we not, and we need to teach our students the different ways in which canonical and anti-canonical texts are used to expand, contract, overrule, and modify the law. And in doing so, we're not really doing history. Because, in fact, if we look at understandings of the Declaration of Independence, time one, they had 5 different theories of equality, we'll discover, and we can stare at them forever and not really choose which is the historical one. More, given the changes in history, we now only have 2 of those theories. We have 13 new ones that are needed to account for everything that's done, that in the long run, we need to understand, teach our students, Jefferson isn't doing the work. 2 things are doing the work. Liberalism is doing the work. What we are really trying to do is use the Declaration of Independence as a vehicle to figure out what is the best understanding of liberalism that fits our constitutional experience, or what is the best understanding of liberal republicanism. Pick your favorite. Another thing that's doing the work is politics. The truth of the matter is, whose vision of the Declaration of Independence will be the vision for the future will depend a lot. Who wins the next set of elections? How is the electoral system biased for some outcomes over another? It is interesting, as I walked into the building today, and I'll conclude on this, I had a different reaction, a lot of people. A lot of people said, isn't this magnificent? To some extent, I saw a little bit of idolatry, that there is worship of the Constitution. There is worship of the Declaration, but I noticed there's a Kennedy exhibit, and it's appropriate to close with a paraphrase of Kennedy, that here in the 21st century, the Declaration of Independence work is truly our own. Thank you.
Well, we have about 15 minutes left. Alex, I don't know, are we also supposed to invite questions from the audience or just? So, and if so, I assume there are mics present or I don't know what the deal is. Okay.
We can always share a mic.
Oh, sure, Mike, right. But actually, what do you guys think about questions? Well, let me just start with one, since Sandy's been sitting patiently in the far southwest. Sandy, I thought I would like to come back to your point about, which I'll just roughly paraphrase, about whether or not there really was an American people, about which you spoke somewhat skeptically, whether we're talking about 1776 or 1788, 1789. I guess I would want to argue to the contrary. That, I mean, there are some obvious exclusions we have to make in terms of our current political preferences. Obviously, we're not going to count slaves in. You can raise the gender question if you want, though I'm not sure how much of a dividing point there'd be in political sentiments. But one of the things that's always struck me about the revolution at both points is that, in fact, using either techniques of revolutionary mobilization in 1774 to 1776, or what I think is the truly brilliant method of ratifying the Constitution in 1787, 1788, the Americans, I think, made an awful lot of progress in terms of taking a somewhat abstract notion of popular sovereignty and to kind of, maybe even to pick up on Mark's final point, turning it into a kind of politically efficacious doctrine. That's to say, I think, I don't think in 1776 it was John Adams' notion of one-third, one-third, one-third. I don't think that's the best characterization of American public opinion. It was pretty hard to be a loyalist anywhere in the American colonies in 1776. In 1787, 88, I think the genius that goes into coming up with the procedures to ratify the Constitution really suggests confidence in kind of having a very efficacious notion of what it takes for one people to be one people. So I think I'm not sure I accept your reading of Federalist too. In this, if I've actually captured it in this context, I'm wondering if you might want to. How you might want to respond to that.
Sure. I think we probably disagree on the weight we should assign the Loyalists. It seems to me, for a variety of reasons, we have a collective vested interest in dismissing their importance and their legitimacy. We want to reduce them really to Thomas Hutchinson, and not recognize, for starters, that Benjamin Franklin's own son remained a loyalist, that there were literally thousands of people who pledged their lives in sacred honor to their Royal Highness King George, who lost what they had in the United States, went into what they saw as exile, and helped to form a vibrant and interesting, and also interestingly different country to our north. The great favor the Loyalists did, of course, was leaving, which has happened only relatively rarely. It certainly didn't happen in France, for example. So then it really does become a very interesting question, in which I think we still disagree, but our disagreement might be more moderate. That is, as of 1787, 88, because the Loyalists had done us the favor of leaving, had we become more of an American people? The answer has to be yes. We had become more. But I have to say, every time I read Federalist 2, I'm just astonished by the insouciance that we share the common language, the common religion, the common set of manners. And I want to think of Agrippa, one of the opponents of the Constitution, who said altogether sensibly, can we really believe that we can have an extended, consolidated republic that will really and truly create a united community, or be based on a united community of people living in Maine and Georgia? And the answer is we didn't. We just 70 years later, we embarked on killing 750,000 people. So it seems to me that we ought to remember those aspects of our history, that we teach a very partial view of the revolution that usually leaves out the loyalists. And then I suspect when we went to college, it was still the case that the events of 1861-65 took place between semesters, and that the first semester ended with perhaps Dred Scott, and then the second semester began with 1877, and we just really didn't want to talk very much, partly because military history is boring, but also because it just raises such fundamental questions about the notion of we the people.
So here, my sense is the mic working?
Yeah.
You can
I can
never
hear
tell,
you.
is to take Jack's point of the Declaration as a political document. And so if someone wrote, "We are one united people" in the William and Mary in a classroom, I think I would grade it as Sandy graded. But of course, "We are one united people" in Federalist 2 is designed in part to create one united people. It's designed to get Americans to think of themselves as one united people. In this sense, the Declaration of Independence is, in some sense, doing what I now say people ought to do with the Declaration of Independence. It is using the rhetorical devices of a time to convince people they ought to do something. Because if we're not one united people, or even if we're not 13 united people, then exactly why this block of land is seceding from another block of land is not clear.
Let's open this up if we can. Bernie, and then over here, there's,
Why don't
here, we've got a mic.
Oh, you got one.
So thank you for such an interesting and provocative panel. I guess I want to put together something Jack said with something Mark said. So I take your point, Jack, that there's a sort of initial intervention of the Declaration as a political act, and then that you also sort of see an after history within American interpretations. And then Mark is emphasizing the way in which there's been a legal turn to the Declaration. And I was just wondering if both of you could say when you think the momentum kind of picks up on the post-history of the Declaration, not as a political act, but as this framework for thinking about equality and all of these other things. And in particular, Mark, for you, when does it pick up as a legal document, do you think?
I mean, I have to say I haven't looked at this literature recently. There is a scholarly literature on how the revolution becomes a commemorative or commemorated event, and the idea that the Declaration of Independence becomes something that you do recite on the 4th of July in front of large spellbound audiences does become part of American political culture. I'm not sure that's wholly the case in the 1790s, but I think by the early 19th century, it's true, and I think certainly by the time you get to antebellum political culture, actually I'll say, I will roughly guess here, say certainly by the 1820s, 1830s. And in terms of the growing anti-slavery movement, the initial forms of expression of desire for equality for women, I think that what I call the corrosive quality of the claim to equality, corrosive of all existing hierarchies, I think that is becoming manifest in American political culture. But I'd have to go back to reread the monographs on that.
Two crucial dates, I think, and not May 1st, 1831, but the Jacksonian era. Jacksonians are the second generation. And in a great many countries, second generations say, well, let's do a constitution for our generation. Instead, you see both Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln in the 1830s, and every major politician pledging allegiance to both the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, Garrison being a notable exception. But that's a very crucial process, and so rather than becoming sort of the device of a generation, the device of a party, the Constitution becomes the continuity, whatever that phrase was. The second is, I think, the Civil War, because in fact, the Republican thesis was the South has betrayed the Declaration of Independence. So the Republicans' understanding was not we're putting in a new constitution values, but we're making the old declaration more clear, and it's the Northern victory enshrines a Northern interpretation, because in the South of about 1850 is the last time you see a debate. Some Southerners, as Alex has pointed out, actually say, no, slavery, when you really think hard about it, is consistent with the Declaration of Independence. But some of them say, no, it's not, and the Declaration of Independence is rotten for that reason. That's the last time you really see a boo Declaration of Independence in American political culture. These people got slaughtered. Getting slaughtered has a major impact on constitutional development that is, we don't study very much. We like to pretend everybody got convinced.
Question back over here, and then up front here. But here.
I could not help but notice the contrast, if not outright contradiction, between using a living declaration in support of an originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Do both of you, or one or more of you, see it in the same way, that we really cannot permanently endure the combination of a living declaration and a fixed originalist constitutional interpretation?
There's a question for Lee, actually. But, well, I mean, I guess, off the top of my head, I would say, and I think this is consistent with Mark's point, maybe with Sandy's, is, in this sense, the Declaration is kind of a free-floating document. If it's not firmly tied, go back to Lee's analysis in the first session, if it's not firmly tied to any kind of fixed mode or canon of constitutional construction, put in Mark's point, it's available to anyone and everyone under whatever circumstances you want. I mean, I hope to think it's something more than Paris Hilton, in its own unique way. But I think they'll get you off that hook. I hope.
I mean, this really is a question for Lee, because I think constitutionalism is a practice, and it's a living practice. It doesn't make sense that there are certain features of the practice. Yeah, you refer to the written constitutional text. You make reference to history when history is on your side, or you pick the historian of the choice, but that's part of the practice. I think the description of originalism in originalist writings doesn't describe the practice fully.
Sandy, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, just very quickly, it just happens to be the case that the case I was teaching in my class this morning is Blaisdell, the Minnesota mortgage moratorium case, which I think has the greatest set of opinions in our history, in that Hughes's opinion for the majority is a brilliant opinion, as is Sutherland's dissent, which is based entirely on Texan history. And it seems to me, one might lament it or not, but Hughes's vision of the Constitution, in which he quotes what I think is the most important single line in our history, which is Marshall's reminder to McCulloch that for the Constitution to endure, it has to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. I think that Mark is absolutely correct. One looks at our practices, and our practices are, for better and maybe for worse, a living, organic Constitution.
One last question down here.
If the same, is this on? If the same body that promulgated the Declaration of Independence also accepted the Articles of Confederation as a way of organizing government, should we not interpret the meaning of the Declaration in terms of the way they decided to organize government?
Being the historian of the Continental Congress, I'll take a quick stab at this. I think you see them as complementary documents, designed to pursue a common political agenda, but without any great concern with the interpretive implications, one for the other. What I was trying to say in my remarks is the Declaration's written. It does, declare something. Declare is like to discover something. It does its work at the time, and then you move on and do something else. I mean, my feeling, anybody engaged in politics knows, 3 weeks is a long time in a political world. That's especially true in the middle of a revolution. So it's not like people are sitting around between 1776 and 1787 saying, what do we say in the Declaration? Do we have a proto-Straussian reading of natural rights here, or do we have some positivist reading? It's I don't mean this in a personal sense. I don't think it's a question really worth asking or pursuing. It doesn't get you anywhere analytically.
Well, if I can jump in on this, it does seem to me that the articles, which are also almost never taught in any of our classes, that the articles vindicate a certain reading of the last paragraph of the Declaration, which is that it is not one united American people in what we would today call a unitary or consolidated government. I mean, I'm with those who view the 1787 Constitution as very much a consolidationist enterprise. That isn't the conception of American politics in 1777. It was a confederation. You go back to Pufendorf, and confederations were the coming together for very limited purposes of quite separate states, and behind that, separate peoples who did recognize the need prudentially to come together for certain limited purposes. Hamilton and others described that as imbecilic by 1786, and I think they were right. But I do think it represents a very important development in American politics.
Well, let me.
Okay. We have the last word. It's 1:15.
Oh.
We have the last word has just come in from Texas.
Okay.
As it happens, and it wasn't Rick Perry pronouncing it or Ted Cruz. It was Sandy. Even better. That's a wrap for this afternoon. We resume at 2:15, I think. Is that the? Alex? Thanks a lot.